Greetings once again from the vicarage, and I do hope that you're all keeping well and safe. It is with a very heavy heart that I have decided, along with the members of our PCC committee, to close the church for worship whilst we are in lockdown. This follows the advice from our bishop and archdeacon, and so along with many churches in our diocese, there will be no services for a while. This is, of course, to keep our church family and the wider community safe. I listened to a medical expert speaking about the new strain of the virus on the news the other morning, and he said the best defence you have against this virus is your front door, because every time you step outside, you are putting yourself and others at risk. I thought that made a lot of sense to me. We will open the church each day from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. for individual private prayer, as we have been up to now. Personally, I have some good news this week. I have a date at last for my surgery. It's going to be Sunday, the 24th of January, which is next Sunday. It will be good to finally get into hospital and begin the treatment. I'll be travelling to London very early on the Sunday morning, and I will be at the London Bridge Hospital, which is on the banks of the Thames. In preparation for my surgery, I am now self-isolating, which means I'm afraid that you won't see me around in the village. And I'm living in a separate part of the vicarage to Sam, and Sophie's actually moved out and moved in with her brother. Today is the second Sunday of Epiphany, and our readings are 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 1 to 10, and the Gospel passage is from John chapter 1 verses 43 to the end. Our first reading takes us way back in time to around 1200 to 1300 BC, to the days of the judges. Because Israel suffered from corrupt priests and judges, the people wanted a king. They wanted to be organised like the surrounding nations. And though it was against his original purpose, God chose a king for them. Of course, if Samuel had his way, there had been no King Saul and no King David. To him, God was king, and Samuel delivered God's message to his people. As a boy, Samuel never really belonged to his own parents. He was God's boy from the very beginning. Samuel's mother, Hannah, saw that. Hannah was one of Elkanah's 2 wives. The family lived in a village called Ramah in the hills of Ephraim, which was a tribal territory and what is now the central part of Israel. Hannah couldn't have children, as Elkanah's other wife cruelly reminded her. But one day, when the family made their annual trip to the tent worship centre in the nearby hill town of Shiloh, Hannah went alone into the tent. Weeping, she prayed for a son, vowing to give the boy back to God in full-time service. Samuel was born within a year. Hannah kept him for a few years and then took him to the worship centre and entrusted him to Eli, the high priest. Each year, when the family went to visit the worship centre, Hannah would take a new coat for her son. Our passage today picks up the story of God speaking to Samuel. Although God has spoken audibly with Moses and Joshua, his word became rare during the 3 centuries rule by the judges. God had become quiet during Eli's time, probably because if his own sons were anything to go by, then many of those around them were of the same attitude. Because Eli's sons were crooked, they took bribes and let money do the talking. They either refused to listen to God or allowed greed to get in the way of any communications with him. Listening and responding is vital to any leadership, any relationship rather, and especially with God. As we know, God does not always use the sound of our human voice like he did with Samuel, but he speaks through his word. To receive his message, we must be ready to listen and then to act on what he tells us. Being ready to say, like Samuel did, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Thinking of my own spiritual journey, and particularly towards ordination, there were many times when God spoke to me, although I didn't always know that it was him. Sometime when I was open to him, I'd be drawn to a certain passage in the Bible. It was as if God had a highlighter pen and marked a few words or verses, and I would read them over and over again and wonder, what do they mean for me, and how and what do I do now? Like Samuel, to begin with, I didn't think it could be God. I thought it must be something else, or I was imagining it. This continued for several years, and it certainly taught me that God has patience, and he is persistent, and if it is to be his will, it will happen one day. I have for many years used daily Bible notes, which give a Bible passage, along with a few thoughts and comments, and some questions to read and to think about. Many times I have had a specific thought on my mind, only to find that when I open my Bible notes, the answer was there in the passage. Now some people might say, well, that's coincidence. And I agree that could happen on occasions. But when it continues to happen again and again, you realise that it is far more than just a coincidence. And you start to wonder, is this really God? However, it still took me a lot more coincidences to convince me, and for me to truly understand what God wanted me to do. I think eventually he got fed up with my doubts and my lack of faith or lack of knowing, and that is when I had the most beautiful and breathtaking vision of him, something that I will never forget. I have shared with some of you this story before, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating what you've already heard. I was in church with my eyes closed and praying. I don't know why, but I had this urge to simply pray to see Jesus' face. After a short while, I saw what I believe and know to be Jesus. He was on a beach walking towards me with his arms open wide. I was frightened to move or open my eyes in case I lost him, and so I just sat staring and enjoying being in his presence. This experience went on for some time, as a friend of mine was waiting in the church with me. Eventually it was time to leave the church, and my friend said to me, "You look as if you were enjoying yourself." That was certainly an understatement, if ever I heard one. I've thought a lot about my experience since then. Even though I prayed to see Jesus' face, I saw his whole body, but not his face. The conclusion that I've come to is that when we get close to God and allow him, he shows us what we ask, but only as much as he believes we need. The rest of it is for us to continue to seek, and when he thinks we are ready and or need, he will give us more. I am continuing to seek more of and about him, as I know you all are. And my prayer is that you will come to know and see the Lord in whatever form he chooses. But in the meantime, be like Samuel and be ready to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Now I'd like to thank you all for your most generous and loving support. I've always known that St Mary's and Cubbington is so much of a caring community, and you have demonstrated that once more again to me. So thank you all, and God bless you. Amen.